New Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. This is part 5 of our 6-part series on consciousness in the brain with Professor Stuart Hameroff of the Banner University Medical Center at the University of Arizona, where he is professor of anesthesiology and psychology. He is the co-founder and director of the Center for Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona and author of Ultimate Computing, Biomolecular Consciousness and Nanotechnology. Welcome back again, Stuart.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Now, we're both wearing these colorful T-shirts,
right.
and I'm so pleased that you brought one for me today because these are the anniversary T-shirts that show that you've been organizing the Science of Consciousness conferences now for more than 20 years.
Yes, the first one that you attended was in 1994.
Yes.
And for the 20-year anniversary conference last year, held in Tucson, we commemorated it by borrowing this line from the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper. It was 20 years ago today. Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. And that famous iconic album cover, which included, at that time, the Beatles and contemporary figures and historic figures. So there have been a number of kind of knockoffs of this. And after consulting with our legal department, we went ahead and did it. And it includes contemporary figures. And being one of the organizers, I got to be one of the Beatles, along with Roger Penrose, David Chalmers, and Christoph Koch. And we have people from Plato to Descartes to William James to modern scientists and philosophers. So it got to be quite an end game deciding who was in and who was out because we only had so many spots. Dave Chalmers and I mostly arranged it with some input from others. And here it is. It's become somewhat popular as an image and makes a pretty good T-shirt, I would say.
And you also let me know that the conference has now been renamed. Instead of being called Toward a Science of Consciousness, you're calling it the Science of Consciousness.
The Science of Consciousness. Yes, when we started, because consciousness cannot be observed or measured directly, it's always been sort of philosophical, and some people use that to kind of ignore it or say it doesn't really exist. It's all an illusion, and there's no big deal anyway, which I think is completely wrong. So it's always been toward a science of consciousness, and there are among us dualists, people who think that consciousness is really outside science. David Chalmers, for example, quite often is a dualist. So it's always been toward a science of consciousness. However, after 20 years, my new co-chairman, George Mishlove, suggested, why don't we call it the science of consciousness? Because it's not that we have the answers, but we're asking the right questions now. We have some good theories. We have testable theories. We have predictions that are made that can be tested, and we have a lot of science to do about consciousness. Again, we're not claiming we have the solution, but we're asking the right questions now. So we are changing to the science of consciousness. A somewhat controversial move. Some people weren't happy, but so be it.
And your Orch OR theory that you developed with Sir Roger Penrose, the great mathematical physicist, one of the developers of the whole theory of black holes, that theory has now been around for 20 years and has withstood a lot of criticisms over that period of time.
Quite harsh criticisms. There was actually a preemptive strike against us by Patricia Churchland, a well-known reductionist materials philosopher, before we even published our first article. We were working on it, but as Roger's wife, Vanessa, told me, you have to be patient because Roger's very meticulous, he's way overcommitted, and nothing goes out until he's completely happy with it. So we had been working on it for a while, but I've been talking about the ideas online and at conferences, and Pat Churchland had heard Roger speak about it at Cambridge, and she published an attack piece in the Journal of Consciousness Studies claiming that he was all wrong about Gödel and that microtubules couldn't be the conveyors of consciousness For example, because a drug called colchicine, which is used for gout, acts by depolymerizing microtubules. And as she pointed out, well, if you take colchicine for gout, you don't lose consciousness. The problem with that argument was colchicine, A, doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, B, doesn't only affects microtubules that are actively assembling and disassembling, and the ones in the brain are quite stable. And the third factor was that if you do inject it into rats, into the brain, as somebody had done for in rats, it pretty much wiped them out. So we were able to counter that, and their attack so annoyed Roger that we got a paper out in 2 weeks after spending a year on our main manuscript.
I see. Well, I can relate to this story because I've had gout and I've taken colchicine, and I can attest it did not alter my consciousness.
No, it actually works by paralyzing the lymphocytes and the macrophages, which migrate into the joint to gobble up the urate crystals. And when they do, they release a bunch of toxins and they cause swelling and inflammation, and that's what causes the pain. So by paralyzing the colchicine, you leave the urate crystals there, but the uric acid crystals there, but you don't have the inflammation due to the white cells. So that's how it works, but it doesn't get into the brain.
Well, that's a digression, but let's focus a little bit more on consciousness itself. Now, this is part 5 of our 6-part series, so I hope viewers will find a way to watch the previous portions if they haven't already, because we've covered a lot about your theory about how the brain operates, how consciousness operates inside of the brain. I think it's interesting to note that your theory is consistent with another interesting approach coming from the field of cosmology. The anthropic principle in cosmology suggests that consciousness exists in the universe itself and may be responsible for actually shaping the universe to support human life.
Well, one solution to the anthropic principle does, and that's the one we agree with. But basically, it turns out that there are about 22 numbers, cosmological parameters that define the universe. The mass of the electron, the charge in the electron, the ratio of the charge and the mass of the proton to the neutron, the cosmological parameter of the expansion of the universe, the dark energy factor, so on and so forth, about 22 numbers.
These are the various constants used in the formulations of cosmologists.
Correct. And the question is, how constant are they? And the bottom line is that if they weren't exactly how they are, then stars producing life and consciousness could not exist. We wouldn't be here. So the odds of these 22 numbers being precisely what they are just astronomical, cosmological, beyond comprehension in terms of the statistical anomaly that does this. And so there's two basic approaches to explaining this. One is that there are an infinite number of overlapping universes. And this plays into the multiple worlds hypothesis, the so-called multiverse. And the idea there is that there's an infinity of universes, and we happen to be in the one universe that's capable of supporting life and consciousness. We won the cosmic lottery. And we are the only one, we are here, therefore we're the ones asking the questions. And all those other dark, cold universes, there's nobody there to ask them. So that's called the weak anthropic principle. Now, the strong anthropic principle suggests that actually consciousness is intrinsic to the universe and is one of those parameters, or is related or influences those parameters. And over eons and eons, the parameters have evolved and mutated so that the universe is actually changing and evolving to optimize consciousness and life. And in the formulation I have with Sir Roger, we're consistent with this. We think that consciousness is intrinsic to the universe, and in fact was there all along before life evolved, before life appeared on Earth, and may have been the thing that caused the origin of life.
Well, recently, Deepak Chopra, a popular writer in the field of human potential and consciousness and Eastern mysticism, has suggested that consciousness also guides evolution.
Right. He's working with Rudy Tanzi. They have a new book called Super Genes. And along those lines, Deepak, who's a spiritualist or believes in the consciousness kind of being everything, said that consciousness drives evolution, that it's not just random mutations. And a few months ago, he got a lot of flack about that from somebody who claimed that this was irresponsible New Age and in very derogatory terms. And I've been thinking along the lines that the objective reduction protoconscious events that we discussed previously have been occurring in the universe all along, or at least since the temperature was right or whatever, and that were there prior to the origin of life. And if these are producing feelings, even primitive feelings, and that in the primordial soup from which life evolved, is that experiments have shown that there's a mixture of just the right nutrients and lighting and water and temperature to allow organic molecules, these aromatic rings, pi resonance clouds, to form. And the nonpolar oil-like regions would stick together, forming environments that are conducive to quantum effects. And so I've written an article, and I'm writing a book about the fact that life actually started in order to access feelings due to protoconscious OR events in the primordial soup. That consciousness actually was there all along. The consciousness has been in the universe, and that life formed in order to access and take advantage of this. And in fact, evolution involves not just random mutations, but there's a feedback fitness function to optimize consciousness, that life evolved more or less to feel good and to be influenced by platonic values. And by feeling good, I mean by resonating with deeper level structures in the universe that were part of this multiple vibrational system that goes all the way down into the universe. And when you feel good, it's because you're resonating with deeper level structures.
Stuart, you mentioned the phrase Protoconsciousness OR events. And of course, people who have viewed the earlier interviews we've done will know what we refer to. But for those who maybe haven't seen the earlier programs, can we define that? Because I know it's crucial to your theory.
Yeah. So this was Roger Penrose's great contribution in his first book. First book on the topic, The Emperor's New Mind, where he said that this self-collapse of the wave function due to an objective threshold caused consciousness. Now, this is in contradistinction to the Copenhagen interpretation, or the conscious observer effect, where consciousness causes collapse. So you have the Schrodinger's cat, dead and alive, or any superposition, and an observer looks at it, and all of a sudden it instantaneously collapses to one or the other. The idea here is just the opposite, that consciousness comes from the collapse, that the collapse occurs spontaneously due to reaching this threshold given by the uncertainty principle, and this can happen willy-nilly anywhere in the world, in matter or even empty space-time, and that gives rise to moments of conscious experience. And so it kind of puts it 180 degrees. It's not that consciousness causes collapse causes consciousness, and is identical to consciousness. Now, we've gotten some flack recently from philosophers, or at least I have, who says, well, you're claiming an identity theory. And I didn't know that was a bad thing, but apparently it entails certain other aspects. But we're sticking by our guns and saying that consciousness is caused by collapse, or collapse causes consciousness, or they're one and the same thing.
The identity theory in philosophy, I suppose, is akin to the idea that neural spikes are the equivalent of consciousness.
That's an identity theory put forth by Patricia Churchland, our reductionist materialist friend, and that's what she says, and I disagree with that for many reasons. But it is an identity theory, and we're claiming a different type of identity theory, that collapse by objective reduction, which is the only type of collapse there is, I would further suggest, gives rise to consciousness, or is consciousness.
Well, the main point, I suppose, of your perspective is that consciousness isn't a product of the brain. Consciousness exists in the universe prior to the evolution of any brain.
Right. That's right. So consciousness, as Deepak says, does drive evolution, but in a different way than he says, because he would say consciousness is everything. What I'm saying is that feelings due to consciousness, due to these OR events occurring in the universe, are originated life. And I'm not saying that Darwin was wrong. I think Darwin was just incomplete. Darwin didn't consider the origin of life. And I think the random mutation business only goes so far. I mean, the selfish gene idea of Richard Dawkins, why would a gene want to or need to promote its survival? The want and need are feelings, and without feelings, what's the motivation? Just survival for what? It doesn't really make any sense. So I'm questioning that, but most of Darwin still stands. It's just a few little areas here and there that need tweaking, I think.
Well, let me step back a minute. We talked earlier about these wonderful T-shirts that we're wearing, and I see Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It reminds me of a wave of activity back in even the 1960s. I know you and I came out of that generation, and the Beatles and this album in particular are expressive of the use of psychedelic drugs in Western culture. And I think a lot of consciousness researchers came out of that era. I wonder if you can comment on the role of psychedelics in the light of your theories.
Right. So I mentioned previously that anesthesia blocks the quantum events, and the psychedelic drugs are all based on aromatic rings, these pi resonance clouds, the cyclical 6 or 5+6 rings with resonance clouds of electrons that are delocalized. And these are conducive to quantum events. DMT, LSD, psilocybin, serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, and dopamine, the pleasure molecule, all have these rings. And they're normally thought to act on receptors, but they also get inside the cell and will affect the microtubules either directly or indirectly through the receptors. And an experiment that I would very much like to see done, and I hope it will be done, would look at the quantum resonances of microtubules in the presence of psychoactive drugs. So on the one hand, we would like to measure quantum resonances in microtubules, which Anirban Bandyapati has shown occur in gigahertz, megahertz, kilohertz, and look at what anesthesia does, and I would predict anesthesia would take it away. And then add a psychedelic, and I would predict that it would increase and enhance the frequency and increase the quantum resonances and take the subject deeper into the quantum world, deeper into the smaller and faster levels of space-time geometry.
In other words, just the opposite of anesthetics.
Correct. As one of the Beatles songs that I like very much said, the deeper you go, the higher you fly, the deeper you go. And I think deeper you go means going deeper into the fine-scale structure of the universe. More intense conscious experience.
That's very interesting. It also leads me to probe the realm of parapsychology, where there's all sorts of research on telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, out-of-body experiences, even events related to reincarnation and life after death. We have 150 years of scientific literature on these topics.
Yeah.
They've largely been excluded from discussions in academia.
Right. Just like consciousness was excluded from study of the brain-mind by the behaviorists, these non-local effects that you described in parapsychology have been excluded because they don't fit with the party line, with the common paradigm of materialist reductionism. But if you include quantum mechanics in consciousness, all bets are off. It's a Pandora's box for the reductionists because it opens the possibility for everything you just said, including action at a distance, non-locality, even afterlife and reincarnation are possible. Because if consciousness is occurring in space-time geometry, normally in the brain, it can occur at that level, at deeper levels, faster levels outside the brain. Until we have a good explanation for consciousness in the brain, we cannot exclude it outside the brain.
Well, this is a little puzzling to me, I admit, because we normally think that consciousness has to be embodied somehow. But if consciousness is functioning outside of the body, what contains it? What holds it?
Space-time geometry. the universe. It's everything. It's everywhere. You can't get away from it. And what that is if you imagine you were shrinking smaller and smaller and smaller, and you get down to a level of a cell, smaller and smaller, you get down to a level of a molecule, and then you get to an atom, and then you get to proton, neutron, quark, and an atom is roughly 10 to the minus eighth centimeter, something like that, and you keep going smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, 25 orders of magnitude smaller than that, you will eventually hit the basement level of the universe, at least as far as we can tell.
This is the Planck length.
The Planck scale, right, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, and very fast, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. And this is where there's things on the way down. If you were shrinking, you might think it would be more or less smooth, but when you get to this level, there's granularity, there's information. And now this information may repeat in a kind of like a fractal at different scales, but it's the origin, it's the origin of the universe, the structure of the universe. And, that's where I think consciousness can go down into this level, and that's where you get into the quantum effects and non-locality, so things can be connected over distance and space and time.
Now, when you say it's the structure of the universe, I presume that what you mean there is it's sort of like the ground of being upon which everything else rests.
Yeah, the ground of being. That's right. And, what it is, nobody knows. People, the string theorists would say that it's vibrating strings. The problem with that theory is that what are the strings vibrating in? They don't give you the background space-time geometry. So they don't really answer the question. Plus, you need all these extra dimensions for which there's no evidence and probably don't exist. Some other approaches include quantum geometry. These are all descriptions of quantum gravity. The structure of space-time comes under that term. And it does involve a merger of quantum mechanics and general relativity. So it's a big deal. Quantum geometry, spin networks. Roger Penrose came out with spin networks in the 50s, I think. And this is the idea that the fundamental stuff of which the universe is made is spin. Now, that doesn't really say what spin is. It's a geometry. It's a pattern. And in the end, Roger says everything's geometry. It could also be what he calls twisters, which are more like vortices and sheaves that kind of flower and unfold. And that kind of transcends scale, because if you think of a vortex, if you go down into the vortex, you're getting smaller and smaller. So these are conceptual ideas. Roger has a new book coming out, Fiction, Faith, and Fantasy in Modern Physics, where I believe he's going to deconstruct a lot of the modern physics, which he doesn't agree with. And following his line, I don't agree with either. String theory, extra dimensions, multiple worlds, multiverse, cosmic inflation. He kind of can get rid of all of them. Now, one more thing. In the last few years, he's recently had a whole nother idea that is amazing. That is that the Big Bang was actually preceded by another eon. And that was originated by another Big Bang, maybe with small b, not big B's, and another. And that there have been a sequence of Big Bangs and eons in one universe. So rather than parallel universes, we have one serial universe that is reborn every, I don't even know how many years. But and they claim evidence. His collaborator, an Armenian astronomer, Gurdjian, claims that they see these concentric rings in the cosmic microwave background. That's a supernova from the previous eon that's imprinted in the Big Bang. And the Big Bang didn't come from a single point. The way Roger described it, it's more like a brush fire from a surface that has grown into the present eon of our universe. So one universe, serial eons. That's the current thinking that I think makes sense.
In other words, time is infinite.
Well, the universe is infinite in time, and the idea that the Big Bang started everything would be wrong, that it goes all the way back. So, yes, time would be infinite, and the origin of the universe is infinitely in the past.
But I presume by that space is not necessarily infinite.
Space is, I think that's correct, but then you have to say, well, what is it infinite? What is it finite in?
Yeah.
So that one I'm going to defer to Roger.
Oh, okay. I know these are mind-boggling questions indeed. But, we've covered a lot of ground here. we've looked at the implications of the idea that consciousness exists at large in the universe. So by that point of view, it would seem as if, coming back to the brain, that the brain doesn't function so much as a generator of consciousness. It's more like a receptor, not quite a TV set that's tuning into the signal, because the signal is here in the brain too. But the brain is designed through the structures you've described, the microtubules and so on, to access consciousness.
Yes, but by the same token, the brain is not simply a passive receiver. That be due to our memories, your memories, my memories, the history of your consciousness and mine, that your consciousness is going to be different than mine. Even though we may be accessing the same platonic values and consciousness in the universe, and which we're also changing. So up to a point, I would say that's true. But I think that you can't ignore the brain and everything that it does, because as far as we know, your consciousness and mine are different.
Well, certainly one of the main points William James made in his classic essay on the stream of consciousness. It's one of the fundamental things that defines us is that we each have our own unique memories.
Right.
And yet there seems to be occasional leakage. Maybe people become superimposed with each other or entangled with each other.
Yeah, I think, I think can be entanglement among people. I think if you're close to someone, it's probably more likely. And, there have been a lot of studies, as you pointed out, in parapsychology, but they tend to be dismissed or ignored because, they're parapsychology, which is kind of silly. And I think, having heard a lot of talks by parapsychologists, I think their statistics are more rigorous than most mainstream scientists.
Stuart Hameroff, thank you so much for being with me.
You're very welcome, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us. Be sure to check your channel listings for part 6 of our 6-part series on consciousness and the brain.